Chinese help to Pakistan has not been trivial for the last about 50 years, somewhere starting after 1960s. And they constructed many things. They helped us in making stadiums, in various military armaments in particular, and lately in making the roads and the powerhouses. The powerhouses is something from which the Pakistan industry would have benefited a lot had there been a proper government policy promoting free enterprise and low taxation rather than higher taxation, and a atmosphere of fear. Chinese strategy in the world, if one has to look very closely at what it could possibly be in the future, one has to look at the map. And if you look at the map of the world, China, no matter how rich it becomes, has got 2-3 basic problems. First problem is that the economy is very export orientated. The luster of the wealth of China is because of exports. And if heavens forbid there is really a conflict and not just saber rattling, and what you see is now that the USA is trying to make an alliance of India and Australia and some other countries against China. Now, on the face of it, it looks just a power sort of thing. But if you look closely at the map, China has got one main problem. China is, although it's not a landlocked country and it has got a considerable amount of coast, but the problem is that the countries, if you look at the area of the South China Sea and the Chinese ports, what you observe is that on one hand is a Korea, one part of Korea, which is obviously an American ally so far. Then there is Japan, and Japan's antagonism with China is nothing new. And Japan, although it is playing low these days, is not a militaristic power, but Japan's potential as a military power is not to be underestimated, and they have shown it in the Second World War. Then further down is Australia. Australia also occupies a large portion of the sea, although it is not a major military power, but it has its own potential. Then if you look, there are countries like Philippines, then there's this huge Indonesia, the Muslim majority Malaysia. Basically, the problem is that the sea access of China is basically hindered considerably in case of any war. Although it is not likely that countries like Indonesia or Malaysia will actively participate, or Philippines will actively participate against any Chinese operation in any war, but these countries are unlikely to help China. Same is the case of that small state called Taiwan, and then obviously Japan is not a friend. South Korea is very wary, and then if you look down in the map, there are coasts. You have got countries like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and most of these countries are now not aligned with the Chinese. They are neutral mostly, and more aligned with the Western world. Then there is further down, Burma these days is aligned somewhat with China. Even Bangladesh is thinking of that. Bangladesh can assume much more importance for China in coming conflicts, because there's a very small territory of India around it, and Bangladesh has got quite a bit of coast. Then, but the problem is that usage of this coast is not easy, because India has got a very great advantage. If you look at the map of India, India is extensively bestowed with the coastline, and that is one of the reasons that there was a time in mid 1600 that India constituted somewhere between 25 and 43% of the entire GDP of the world, because on the left side it can trade with the entire East African coast. On the other side it can also trade with the entire Middle East. Then on the other side there's the Southeast Asia. There are substantial Indian focuses, even Hindus and so on, throughout Southeast Asia. Historically, this area was divided into China and Indochina. Now, the thing is that since the Chinese and the Indians are at very different economic system, I think Indian output GDP is probably about 2 trillion or something like that, and the Chinese is obviously 12 trillion. There's a lot of problem there. But one thing is that had India been a more organized society, had it been more an equitable society, had it not been a retrogressive type of society, which even up to today does not actually believe on the street in the equality of humans, what to talk of minorities. This is a great disadvantage to India, and this type of attitude of not relying on oneself and always trying to immigrate and more propaganda than substance, that basically does not make India in the medium term, or short term or medium term, a very big rival, except in case of any conflict. In case of conflict, the presence of the Indian navies on this side and hostile environment against China in the South China Sea basically means that China's naval power has to be very, very great. But it is very doubtful that China can accumulate a naval power greater than that of USA and the Western world, provided the Western world does not enter into a downward spin, which it can always do because of the increasing pressures from the commoners of those countries and their running of the state, and they don't sometimes fully understand the international implications or history or so on. Whereas wars require a very determined type of leadership and a single direction, which even USA at presently is not on the right course. But still, when it comes to Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump, both of them have got an anti-Chinese policy, and as a matter of fact, while Mr. Trump was more focused towards the economic part of it and to make sure that China is not hindering American recovery and helps also via tariffs in the American recovery. Mr. Biden has got a very unclear type of agenda, which is which could ultimately end as a militaristic issue, because uh, there is no economic pathway being thought. China's these helping on the roads all over the world, and making routes to Europe, and making friends in Africa and friends everywhere. You know, this is basically a manifestation of that long-term fear of the Chinese ports or Chinese naval routes being hampered in the long run, stopping its exports. Now, in this context, uh, it is highly doubtful that any of these countries, in the case of a conflict, uh, would really like to defy the Western world. It is a bit unlikely, because China has got a very big disadvantage. One other disadvantage of China is that, unlike the Western world, uh, generally speaking, people in Africa, people in former Commonwealth and some of the countries, they don't have unlike that in the West, where they have got their people of these countries have got their children studying, they might have properties there, there are settlers there. There is a cultural connection between the West and some of these countries, and most of these countries. And cultural connection, although China is giving scholarship, there are people there, people go there very often, and businesses and so on. But there is not a people-to-people cultural connection between the Chinese and all the countries it trades with, except in terms of business. Now, this is a very weak point, because in the war of emotions and the war of emotion and interests, I think that the militaristic option of China is a non-starter. China, the problem with China is that China has, over the last 1 century or so, not really internally internationalized itself as much as the Western countries have internationalized. So even these land routes, which China is developing so generously and helping many countries, and even in Pakistan, there is a significant improvement in roads, and especially in areas which are not um, developed before. The same is in Africa, where it is one of the, if not the biggest investor, and several governments are under its influence. But this is the power of money. This is the power which has not been tested in case of a conflict. And most likely, in case of a conflict, many of these countries, African and other countries, although they will not side with USA, they will declare neutrality, but in effect, they are not going to help China that much. With this thing, frankly, Chinese have got no option. The only good option the Chinese had was a non-military option, and the pathway on which they were treading for the last 25, 30 years, and the pathway of development and cooperation. Now the next question is, can the middle classes of the Western world do without the cheap Chinese goods? This is a very big question, because at present what we see is that there is a great dependency of the middle classes of entire Europe and USA, and in fact the entire world, on cheap Chinese goods. If these goods stop coming, the standard of living of the middle classes can fall considerably, because the local manufacture can be very expensive. This is a very important aspect. Then there is, of course, the aspect of mutual trade. Even biggest rivals of China, like India, have got a very heavy mutual trade. Same is the USA, same is the Europe, same is the rest of the world. Even Middle Eastern countries, the sheikhs and so on, who were so closely aligned to USA, are now dependent on the oil sales to the Chinese and countries of these types, and they have to alter their foreign policy accordingly. In other words, in a militaristic sense, China is no match for the Western power because of the very widespread influence and very systemic and cultural influence of the Western world. But in a normal peacetime thing, China is an unbeatable economic power, and that thing goes very well. Now comes some of the internal issues of China, or at least what it considers as internal issues. It is historically well known, and it is always expected in large-sized empires. It doesn't matter whether it is Russia, whether it was Britain of the past, or whether it was USA in the past, whether they were the Ottomans or the Mughals or any of the large empires, or the Persian, the Arab Empire. All of the empires, there is always a tendency at the periphery of the empire of people wanting to secede and people not accepting the mainstream. And that is the basic reason that Chinese claims on Tibet, Chinese claim in Muslim China, is not accepted all over the world. Even in the Muslim world, many do not accept this claim because there is a strong evidence that people of this area have time to time rebelled against the imperial China of the time, and there is these days a tendency to follow the aspirations of the people. The recent what Chinese say is the re-education program to root out terrorism, while the Western people say it is a combination of trying to colonize the Muslim China and converts its Muslim majority into a minority, is not helping Chinese, especially in the Muslim world. You see, one thing which people don't realize, and you just have to look at the map of the world. No power, no bloc in the world is so much bestowed with geographical power than the Muslim bloc. For example, if you look at the map closely, starting from Senegal in West African coast, coming towards the North Africa, going towards Egypt, going towards the Red Sea, going towards the Persian Gulf, then India, Pakistan, then the Bangladesh coast, then the Indonesia, then the Malaysia, even parts of Philippines. Muslims, when it comes to the coast, are owners of probably not less than 24,000 miles of the world. No power regarding the geographical presence and the multiraciality can equal Muslims. No power, not even the American power. America is just one country. Europe is a very small place compared to Asia and Africa as terms of area. So basically in the world, there are two basic religions which do compete with each other, especially in Africa for its followers, and these are the Christianity and Islam. The Christianity received a great flip, a great advantage after the discovery of the Americas. Otherwise, it was not a dominant religion, not a major religion in the world. Uh, Now, these geographical things cannot be ignored. The religion cannot be ignored. The race cannot be ignored. The conflict between the pure whites of Northern Europe and the others like Hispanics, Latino, and so on is also a fact. The conflict between the Western Europeans and the Russian races is also a historical fact. Even British and French rivalry is also a historical fact. But the thing is that when the Chinese had these policies in Muslim China, Xinjiang, they forgot that, and they cannot forget, that all their corridors, which they are so fond of to Europe and everything, have to pass through Muslim lands. So basically, when it comes to the era of conflict, China does not have that dominant position. Chinese foreign policy and Chinese economics works best in peacetime. It is the view of many that, for example, the corridor to Pakistan, the CPEC corridor, was not just a corridor for the Chinese exports to go to Gwadar and so on. It was just a emergency planning of China that in case there is problem in the South China Sea, they are able to have some presence in the Persian Gulf. Now they have got an agreement with the mullahs of Iran, and this is a strategic agreement. Maybe their interest and the way they are taking interest in Afghanistan and the Taliban is that maybe they have felt that Pakistan, because of close ties with the West, both culturally and in the past militarily and at people level, and also to some extent economically also, is may not be that willing to take sides with China in a major world tension or conflict. Although they do have control of Gwadar port, and Gwadar is not the only port. Chinese have probably got bought areas, or they have leased about 22 or 23 ports in the world, which basically reflects the anxiety of China of a coming conflict. Now, this type of anxiety is leading to a paranoia, which is increasing the militaristic potential. And in fact, if you see the moves of China in the Muslim China, for example, and in some of these things, I don't think that this will be advantageous to China. The CPEC corridor could have been a very important corridor of Chinese-Indian trade, of which Pakistan could have also benefited as a transit. Pakistan could have benefited from the Iran-India pipeline, which was obviously economically at least, although there is always a danger because even in case of war or something, if you stop a pipeline to India, the Iranian would be angry because their revenue will fall. So there are some economic issues with even that project. But these days, Europeans are also planning, and they are also there. In fact, they are using a lot of Russian oil and gas resources. So a primary decision has to be made, not by USA alone, not by Europe alone, not by people of Indo-Pak subcontinent or India, Australia, but also by China, that which route do they want. The carrot and stick policy, which the Chinese think that it will work, I doubt it. That will only increase the tensions, and unlike the rest of the world, the English speaking and that type of word, the problem is the language barrier and the cultural barrier between Chinese and the rest of the world can result in a paranoid like atmosphere and conflict. So, this is not a very suitable thing. Now, regarding the future of Pakistan's strategy in the future, regarding China, regarding Afghanistan, regarding Iran, regarding India, the problem is that India knows that it can become a great world power provided it has got an economic engine. India thinks it has got an economic engine, but it does not really have that type of economic engine which is required for the domination. Although they have the geographic and the other things, because India in the past, the Hindu rulers and so on, this faith and these types of people, not exactly Indian, but these mixed races or Indians, they had a considerable sway in the Southeast Asia. Many of them were rulers there, Hindu rulers and so on, and Islam supplanted that. Now that brings to the problem. On one hand is the Hindu expansionism and Mahabharata type of idea. On the other hand, China wants to become a great power, and USA and West are afraid of their loss of their military domination, and Pakistan is hopelessly sandwiched between the aspirations. And then never forget the Iranian designs, because all the ancient powers, including the Persian, the Arabs, and French, and British, and Russian, and so on, as I said, all of them have got militaristic tendencies, all of them have got expansionist tendencies, and these are historical tendencies. Whenever they get a chance or whenever their internal situation allows, these are historical things. We cannot alter history. We can only look at history, we can only look at the various things. Now, Pakistan's problem is that Pakistan has got such a huge civil and military bureaucracy that his economic engine cannot sustain that. That meant getting help from the Chinese, that meant getting help from the USA, getting help from the West, getting help from especially the Arabs on easy terms. But in the coming years, the problem is that Arabs are also getting dry, and their population is increasing. They may not be that willing to, and they will not be in a position to help so much Pakistan as they have helped before. It is just a matter of a decade or so that considerable help from Middle East is unlikely to continue. Next is the problem with Iran. Now, Iran has got a very strange foreign policy. Had the Shah remained, and had Iran been, Iran would have been one of the top 25% income earners, average GDP of the world, if that had, and it not had involved itself with wars, and not had a very big military system which is draining and the military expansion. Although many of these military projects of Iran are actually supported by outside powers, even though on the face of it they might be antagonistic, because otherwise had Iran really worked against the interest or crucial interest of USA or some other country, they would have definitely damaged it much more, and possibly have even overwhelmed these regimes, no matter how well established they might seem. So it doesn't worry them in the sense that there is a conflict in the Middle East and the Arabs should also remain under the thumb and so on. And this type of approach and this type of atmosphere is not good. many of the new generations, Shias of Pakistan, are heavily influenced by the leadership in Iran and what they say daily and so on. So they have got an influence here. And then, if there is some country which which has got a very variable type of influence in Pakistan, is India. India has got a lobby in Pakistan, and that lobby includes some intellectuals and some lefties of the past. And in some of these areas of Balochistan, they used to have some sympathizers in KPK and so on. But it is not the determining influence in Pakistan. Chinese influence is only present in the offices and then the military or something. Chinese influence is not there in Pakistan at the street level. Influence, if there is the Western influence, because of large number of Pakistanis living in the diaspora. There are almost about 17 million, and probably about two-thirds might be in Middle East and one-third in the rest of the world, especially in the Western world and Africa and so on. Now, this type of complex scenario means that China needs to review its foreign policy, China needs to review its military policy, and China needs to relax on the Muslim Indochina, and their effort to settle the Chinese in Muslim China and so on is creating apprehensions in the neighboring countries also. And ultimately, this type of policy cannot help in China in establishing a land route in case of any war, because most of the countries down there, in case of a war, are not going to side China openly. So with this, I would say that Pakistan, from Pakistani point of view, good relations with all the neighbors should also always be a objective, and but that is generally not possible because of the very high ambitions and aspirations of everybody, and you cannot even underestimate the aspirations of the Taliban regime or the Pashtuns from the north. After all, they have invaded India many times. So the thing is that Pakistan, unfortunately, has got many potential invaders. The Western, they are now contracting, but at one time there was always a possibility of some Western powers trying to capture coastal areas of Balochistan. There was always in fact, not only a possibility, but a claim within Iran of capturing parts and major parts of Balochistan. There was also this type of claim from Afghanistan. Then there was also claims of the ethnic Pashtun, still Jhelum. Then there is the claim of India over parts of Kashmir and so on. So this is a very complex environment. I won't say this is an explosive environment, but an avenue, but an attitude of paranoia in the world affairs and not dealing with diplomacy can lead to flaring up of the whole thing. So my impression is that Chinese should play economically, Chinese should play that way. It is demand in certain Western circles that China should increase the value of its currency, because increasing the value of its currency will reduce its exports to the Western world and to the entire world and make room for the Western world. But I think the Western world is, although they have helped China develop economically, the German technology, the Western technology, the Japanese and so on, and before that the Russian, they have helped develop China economically and industrially. There's no doubt about that. But the thing is that the main problem of the fall of the Western world, in my view, economically, is not just China. It is because of a fundamental problem in the power structure internally of the Western world. And you might say that the media and the people from the streets and so on, who are not that endowed with the qualities of leadership, have captured most of the important institutions of the Western world. So the decline of the Western world is not just due to China, it is because of the decline itself. Decline in family values, decline in morality, decline in high-class political thinking, decline in the valor. The problem to find an evil China is not the issue. Now that is another thing that Muslims, even though they are often charged with being less liberal than the others, but Muslims believe in a lot of human rights, a lot of things, and they find that in the Western world, although the mosques may not be allowed to say azan openly, but there are mosques in every European city. Some of them are funded by the metropolitan corporation and so on. So they would like to see the same thing in China before taking any sides. So in the sense, the Muslim naval potential and the environment around the China is not very suitable for long-term militaristic things. The upper side is, of course, Mongolia, and then there's Russia. Russia is a great military power, but Russia is not a great economic power. Russia can only, and it doesn't have very huge population and so on. So it is more of a kind of help for China in case they wish to be, but it is not going to prove a long-term ally. So in this context, I would say that Chinese have to review their foreign policy, Chinese have to review their militaristic policies, and Chinese have to review, and very importantly, review their cultural policies and tolerance of the religion, because otherwise Chinese have got no allies in the world with these types of segregationist policies. So with this I would end in a good tone, and Pakistan and China have been great allies, and we want this alliance to continue. But the thing is that there has to be a similarity, there has to be cultural tolerance, there has to be religious tolerance all over, and there has to be racial tolerance, and there has to be some degree of internationalism, and an approach which is not reminiscent of any racism or reminiscent of any cultural superiority or reminiscent of anything. Although one has to acknowledge that although COVID started from China, unlike the Western world, the Chinese have largely controlled the COVID epidemic. It could have been the biggest victim of that, which basically shows the discipline of China is very strong, and it helps the economy, and in fact helps every economy. Even India cannot become a great power unless there is a good discipline in India. Pakistan cannot stand on its leg unless it has got discipline, and it helps the free enterprise, it reduces the size of the government and reduces the power of the civil servants against the tax-paying class and so on. There are certain things which are applicable to the entire world. It is not possible that something should be applicable to only China and not us, or to us and not China. Thank you very much with this.